Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, first of all, I should like to express my sincere thanks to the Archive of Latvian Folklore for inviting me to this very interesting as well as important conference. It is my great pleasure to be here in this exceptional building. I have also the honor to greet Dr. Andres Wilks, the director of the National Library, from our director, Robert Zepf. Since the Wossidlo archive is supervised a little bit more by the university library, normally, of course, we are the scientists who are watching from the science point that archive, but since we have built that digital archive Wossidlo, we have a much more closer connection to the university library, which provides the digital archive for sustainability. As Lauri just pointed out in his paper, collections and collections are not considered to be proper to standards. But a digital archive must be able to depict the specific structures of a collection or of collections. And in this sense, Wossidlo may be considered as a pioneering project. So it deals with also because it deals with a regional collection. Evidently, for the first time, a folklorist estate, that is to say, the handwritten archive of one of the larger collectors of the early discipline, has been put on the internet. In fact, the whole estate, no small assortment of inconceivable, well-readable, or aesthetic documents. A pile of about 2 million handwritten documents, which fortunately has been well structured by Richard Wossidlo before. As regards the technical side, in the Wossidlo project, the so-called hypergraph model was to be pilot tested, thus showing new solutions for the digital presentation of idiosyncratic folklore collections. In this paper, I will outline the challenge of building Wossidlo, including difficulties we faced during the project. The virtual representation of Richard Wossidlo's ethnographic collection of Mecklenburgian folklore and dialect language went online in 2014. In return to its financial support by the German Research Foundation, Wossidlo has become an open access archive. There are no charges for its use. All its sources are freely available. Even though my paper will mostly cover the issues clustered around the key point of archival practice, I will also talk about research perspectives of computational folkloristics, a term which in the last years has mostly been shaped by Timothy Tangolini and Theo Meder in several of their articles. Needless to say that there is a lot of added values resulting from digital transformations of folklore material, though vice versa, many problems are occurring. At best, users do not need to travel in order to find, excerpt, or copy archival sources, and will save a lot of time and money that can be invested in more extensive search and more intensive research. Ideally, unknown sources will come to light, which in pre-internet times would never have been taken into consideration. Thus, insofar, the ideal scenario. However, digital accessible corpora of archives and museums are still in their infancy. Though the building of digital archives has accelerated, we are still at the beginning of a new era and have little experience. E-born folklore archives have mostly been generated from the internet, which leads to new discursive forms like email hoaxes or virtual images like Photoshop Law or internet memes. All these electronic and often short narratives like jokes, riddles, rumors, and contemporary legends, as well as longer formats like fairy tale films, and their mix with other filmic genres have one thing in common. They have been widely distributed via mass media or the internet. Folklorist experts and amateurs are on the guard to catch and store them. However, the digital transformation of a classical analog folklore archive leads to the imperative of quite new dissemination. In my view, the central mission of digital archives is not to present well-prepared fruits which have been published in printed formats before. This is a side effect and can be solved by the library's concepts, digitization concepts. Our primary task is to present source material, that is, the sources behind publications and the sources which never have been published before, which have been ignored after paradigm shifts, which have never been viewed from other disciplines, and so on. In pre-digital times, folklore archives were hidden from the general public. Only some experts got access to folklore archives. The public got in touch with carefully selected sources which were presented in a readable, annotated, and understandable format. As a consequence, we need to differentiate between two types of digital archives. On the one hand, archives which are collecting and preserving well-prepared stories ready for research or new dissemination. The archive of the now completed Encyclopédie des Märchens is such a type, where printed texts have been arranged according to the Anna Thompson system. Here, the main focus was to collect and translate foreign language texts for comparative purposes. It would make total sense to present this text archive free accessible online, particularly with regard to the translated versions. In my opinion, such an archive could be built cost effectively because of its flat structure, but for copyright reasons of the publishers, this idea will probably not be carried out. The same applies to Lutz Röhrich's legend archive in Freiburg, the so-called Freiburger Sagenarchiv, which includes Heukert's archive for the torso remained Handwörterbuch der Sage. On the other hand, there are archives preserving sources like field notes, correspondences, audio and video recordings, including their transcripts at best, which in other words are pre-stages of the publication level. This type of online archive is strongly determined by the archival work that has been done by the ethnographer or subsequent scientists. Are there typewritten transcripts of handwritten documents, for example? The Central Archive for German Folk Tales, for example, the so-called Zentralarchiv der Deutschen Volkserzählung at the Institute of European Ethnology in Marburg, is a collection of typewritten folk tales in many different dialects. Concerning the estate of Richard Wossidlo, approximately 30,000 transcripts from fieldwork have been made, but not more. However, they only hold a share of 10% of Wossidlo's own fieldwork documents. In reality, both types of digital archives are often mixed, which for instance applies to Theo Meeder's Dutch folktale database at the Mertens Institute. Of course, it is much more difficult to present archival material digitally as a result of its heterogeneous structure and unconventional arrangement. While card catalogs of libraries follow strict rules, scientists make their own creative card file system, which is idiosyncratic. This applies particularly to folklore collections or folklore genres, especially those which are very difficult to be classified, like belief legends or genres which are beyond the classical canon. And I will talk about this type of archives. Before I start to describe the Wossidlo project and its material, I will summarize some fundamental requirements of archiving folklore digitally. There are not a few problems occurring when a digitization project is planned or carried out. Lack of financial resources, legal and ethical problems, technical feasibility, and so on. However, the most important thing is the discipline's attitude towards its elder ethnographic collections. With some exceptions in Germany, European ethnologists and even folklorists don't seem to be interested so much in the early ethnographic collections of their discipline. As Lauri has remarked in his paper, they are the stronghold of folkloristics. Instead, traditional archives serve as an example for the research about the history of Volkskunde. The critical findings are essential, of course, even though in not a few cases a little bit exaggerated or even devastating, sometimes judgments without any local expertise. Whatever the case is, the elder collections are not en vogue. Out of sight is out of mind. Nobody even comes up with the idea of using the fruits of one's criticism in the digital transformation process. Compared to printed books, digital presentations can easily be annotated by the scientists themselves. In Germany, for example, since many years, the colleagues cannot agree about the digitization of the Atlas of German Volkskunde instead of contributing their criticism into its digital presentation. In fact, archival information should provide points of reference which allow users to trace the genesis of knowledge back, to see how it was crafted to information and how data have been interpreted to information. Any kind of stored information is born from formally circulating knowledge and may be considered as potential news stories. Folklore archives are to be viewed in this mind. An archival information only makes sense if it can be reconstructed within its different loops of circulation. Thus, digital folklore archives should not only represent ready-made folklore, but also folklore in making. We are well advised to become aware of the fact that we are utilizing archival information to create our knowledge for our benefits within our current research programs. Knowledge and stories are part of it, is always set in context and goal-oriented. Knowledge always needs a subjective frame of reference. Like in storytelling, everybody creates their own frame, a version of knowledge. To transfer knowledge to information, this is what the collectors and their networked helpers did, and to recreate information to knowledge, and this is what the archivists, respectively scientists, do. One always needs a person. Lauri stressed on this point in his paper. In other words, knowledge is the result of a decision-making, and decision-making never takes place by computers, or perhaps partly artificial intelligence. Perhaps we'll see what will happen. The same applies to storytelling. What does this mean for the building of digital archives? Digital archives are required not only to depict contents and formats or styles, but also the actors, like informants, collectors, and researchers. Tradition is always influenced by social groups or networks and individuals. If digital archives are able to show or even touch this process of folklore in making, they are on the right path to reveal the epistemological dimension of folklore collections, to highlight folklore collection as a mode of folklore production. In my view, the collection of folklore, including the data acquisition of amateurs, is part of the research process. I'm not a friend of drawing strict borders between the academic and amateur sphere, just like I'm not a friend of dividing the roles of the scientific archivists and the large remainder of scientists without archival backgrounds. In short, since folklore archives are research collections, the discipline itself has to promote, in terms of scientific political arguments, the digitization process. We try to keep in mind such consideration when now I try to explain some fundamental structure, the fundamental structure of Wossidlo's collection, and afterwards I will explain you the Wossidlo project. So some short sentences about our central collector, Richard Wossidlo. He worked as a secondary school teacher of Latin and Greek, yet he applied his real passion to the study and collection of traditional folklore in his own Mecklenburgian country. It is remarkable that a self-educated ethnographer tied to his career as a teacher grounded three sustainable developments: the Wossidlo archive, which was posthumously solidified by the Berlin Academy of Sciences, thus laying the foundation of folklore research in the former GDR. Wossidlo's exhaustive compiling of dialect lexis, that is to say the recording of the Low German language as it has been spoken in Mecklenburg in the 19th and early 20th century. Based on this foundation, the Wossidlo Teuchert, one of Germany's large-scale dialectal dictionary, has been created. And thirdly, Wossidlo's influence on the development of Mecklenburgian folklore museums must not be forgotten. A central component in Wossidlo's collection are field recordings of handed-down narratives. Like tried herbarium material, slips describing similar contents of a specific cultural expression were put in little paper pouches, thus bringing together varying motifs, figures, or requisites, and labeling types and subtypes. These little paper bags were made from the cover material of exercise books. In a similar way, synonymic words describing a special semantic field were put in the same convolute. All pouches, including smaller ones, are stored in small boxes made from cedar wood. The boxes were formed to larger units. Compared to the book system, which presents information in a fixed order, paper slips are flexible and can be used as a hypertext system, whereas in a book one is restricted to add some marginalia or interlines. At the beginning of his fieldwork, Wossidlo used to note field data in books of various sizes, but even if he used large formats, the storage was not sufficient, as you can see on the slide. This book also shows that he never stopped collecting, even if he had published a special folklore topic before. You can see here in the middle is a newspaper article. Danish folklorist Evald Hank Christensen, perhaps the greatest collector not only in Denmark but in the world, noted like Wossidlo on loose slips at the beginning of his ethnographical work, but then switched to the sheet format. This may be explained by Wossidlo's more walking outside and encyclopedic fieldwork style, whereas Christensen tended to hold several meetings with his informants and was resolved to publish his earnings as soon as possible. Similarly, the field notes of famous Estonian collector Jakob Hurt are stored in bound form. Maybe one can say that Wossidlo introduced a kind of new fieldwork style in German discipline Volkskunde. According to the elder ethnographic concepts, professional scientists did not carry out any fieldwork by their own. Empirical data mostly had been collected by amateurish helpers, whereas professional scientists restricted themselves to analyze and interpret such data. The brothers Grimm, for example, got most of their sources from correspondence. Wossidlo overcame this unfavorable division of work between professionals and amateurs. On the one hand, he collected with the help of correspondents who did fieldwork on behalf of his instruction. This slide shows his large network of helping collectors. On the other hand, however, he worked himself as a field worker. In Wossidlo's time, one was missing any electronic support for copying information. Thus, people were forced to decide much faster than we do today which part of perceived information could be useful. Philologists of previous generations usually took excerpts from books stored in libraries by writing relevant contents on paper sheets or paper slips in order to take them to their own workstation, where they put them in ideocratic card file systems. To some extent, philologist Richard Wossidlo applied this principle on his method of field research. He took notes on small pieces of papers. Fairy tales, legends, customs, and other folk traditions were not recorded in great length and detail, but stored according to semantic aspects in a growing thesaurus, which became very slender. Wossidlo's paper slips are not mere summaries, but rather a chain of excerpts. Some researchers considered him as an impatient, restless field worker who had taken his notes very hastily, but this does not do justice. Taking into consideration that his plan was to describe a wide range of passing traditions and vernacular language, he had to manage large amounts of data. Consequently, he economized his work by developing specific routines and tools like his file card system. In order to fully understand the meaning of a single field note, one has to read a JSON slip, at the best the whole bundle. Doing so, the excerpts may be put together like a puzzle which describes different aspects and dimensions of a story. They are like different shootings of a special phenomena taken from different places, narrators, and perspectives. To give an example, in some of Wossidlo's notes about customs relate to Christmas Eve, varying dialectal names of the figures which accompanied Santa Claus are mentioned. Ruklas, a variant of helper Ruprecht. Christchild, Billy Goat, Beer and his leader, Ghost Rider, and many more. Some notes are dedicated to children's fear, some about the masks, and in a few slips we may even find some feedback from the informants. For example, what did they think about rituals causing fear to the children? In another paperback, perhaps we may find several notes about performative aspects and so on. Wossidlo's helpers wrote down their ethnographic data more detailed in the format of letters, and he also excerpted the correspondence and put the slip in the thesaurus. Another type of paper slips are excerpts from literature, very often published very often has been published ethnographic data or comments about them. Of course, one single field note is comparatively of little information value, whereas the combination with other field notes and e.g. social data about the narrators are fruitful. As a consequence, the idea was born to represent Wossidlo's field note excerpts and referring corpora within a semantic web. This is the deeper goal of Wossidlo. Now it is time to come to my next point, the database model of our digital archive. Typed directed hypergraph techniques implemented on top of an object-related database system seem to be the best solution for a digital transfer of an idiosyncratic knowledge system such as Wossidlo's card file boxes. But what are directed hypergraphs? What is their significant advantage? While usual graphs are only able to model pairwise interactions, hypergraphs can perform high-order interactions and thus describe complex systems such as social networks, non-classical molecular structures, or machine language learning processes. Around the archival sector, documents are usually managed by attached sets of descriptive metadata. Similarly, the interrelationships between the documents can only be represented by flat structures. Graph data structures provide a better solution for representing the interconnectivity between documents and metadata and can be queried efficiently for information retrieval based on XML, which allows data exchange via internet. Even simple graphs, however, rapidly reach their limit because they can only describe facts containing not more than 2 nodes. Nodes are perhaps actors, objects, time, place, and so on. What we need is a mechanism to keep metadata together. The solution is the typed directed hypergraph model. In this model, a simple fact is represented by a such called hyperedge. The hyperedge itself is represented by this red dashed line holding together what belongs to a fact. All participating metadata items are represented as nodes, and they are attached to the hyperedge via arcs. These are the arcs, and they are like arrows between center point and nodes. Hyperedge arcs or links are representing different roles an object node can play in certain relationships. Hypergraphs are now overlapping hyperedges. On this slide we can see 3 facts. The principle of overlapping allows to combine fragments so that a puzzling process can be started to get a lot of contextual data. This allows it to represent comparatively isolated elements like motifs in an enriched environment, referring to narrators, collectors, social data, historical context, different semiotic systems, and so on. It also helps you to search missing links to identify, for example, homonym family names, place names, and so on. In the Wossidlo system, the typed hypergraph model, in the Wossidlo system, the directed hypergraph model is typed, which means that nodes, hyperedges, and hyperedge arcs are associated with a type. For example, all nodes included are describing activity. You told about that entity of activity. Or, for example, all nodes included in a hyperedge are performing the message type of medium. For example, is it oral or is it written language? This slide shows a more complex this slide shows a more complex hypergraph which depicts, for example, a working tool in a ritual context. Nevertheless, this hypergraph is very simple because in reality much more relationships are to take into account, so that the hypergraphs are very difficult to be depicted at all. Now I come to my next point, the workflow of Wossidlo. Wossidlo has mostly been funded by the German Research Foundation and its special program for digitization projects. And secondly, Wossidlo has been funded by the Federal Office of Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance. What's that? The Federal Office supported the project according to its subtask of long-term preservation. Due to the Hague Convention in Germany, documents of national value are microfilmed. These microfilms are put into stainless steel tanks and stored in an old silver mine in southwest Germany, the so-called Barbara-Stollen. Our project started in 2010 with a European-wide tendering. We had to find a trustful company to digitize and microfilm 2 million different pieces of papers. Beforehand, we had to prepare all documents for outdoor digitizations. Field notes and letters had to be paginated, what is very time-consuming. Our computer scientists developed a barcode system to describe the categories of all convolutes. A further problem was passed by differing formats here we see two extreme examples. This one is 0.5 meter long, and this display gives an example by this piece of letter and so on. So a lot of differing formats. The following two slides show an overview of these processes. The first slide makes clear that even the pure digitization process is not trivial, here including analog, long-term preservation, analog and filming of the material. We had a lot of mistakes which had been made by the digitization producer, and this all had to be managed. But this is only the digitization workflow. To build the whole archive is much more complicated because it exists of different modules. For example, you need an input module, you need a structural editor module, you need retrieval modules, and much more. So this is not trivial to manage the digital informations and to put them on the internet. So now let's try to add metadata into the digital archive. A describing module was developed, which is much more than a simple input mask. The horizontal tape shows the preview of the paper slips or letters, and in the left corner here, down there, you can see the buttons for creating the metadata and catchwords. By this instrument, one can also build hypergraphs. Here you can see two hypergraphs. One is for the recording data, the other is for the content data, to keep them together. The hypergraph technique makes it possible to realize the container in the container in the container principle. So you can go very deep into the material. Now let's enter the Wossidlo app. I will not do it online because it takes too much time, and I must come to my end. The various corpora are represented by icons and captions which are linked with each other. The different corpora are arranged in the shape of an arch. Corpora which contain field notes and letters about folklore and folklife, linguistic material, and even an inventory register about museum tools. In the lower area, the different types of metadata are listed: places, persons, roles of persons, thesaurus, abbreviations concerning field notes, literature and their abbreviations, questionnaires, tale types, motifs, and transcriptions. There are two ways to navigate through the collection. Firstly, the conventional way, which follows the topology of the archive. If you click on a box, all convolutes are listed, and if you click on a selected convolute, the field notes are shown. In this example, we can see an excerpt of a legend about a cruel master. This is only the first page, a master who was linked by his work people. This is my favorite example I always show when I'm presenting Wossidlo. On the right side, the links are listed. If you click on the name of the informant, for example, you will see his repertoire, social data, his age, and so on. And you can also find the field recording data. In this example, we noted a special motif according to Stis Thompson's motif index, blood stain that cannot be cleaned. However, this way of indexing is very time consuming and depends on your research goals. We urgently need translations into different languages, which means that beforehand handwritten texts must be transformed to typewritten texts, and then from Low German to High German and into the English language or into other languages. Hypergraphs provide an enormous advantage for language translation. Using the hyperedge type specific language, a single word can be translated into different languages, including dialects. Adding the hyperedge type translation, the original word and its multilingual transformations are grouped to a hypergraph. In a similar way, blurring ethnological terms due to disciplines' paradigm changes or different uses in other countries can be interconnected by the hyperedge type synonym. By the links, we will perhaps also find a correspondence, and if you click on it, a letter will be shown in which the variant of the legend is told in detail. At this point, it is important to mention that Wossidlo allows it directly to combine different corpora with each other, referring notes with correspondences, a folklore material with linguistic corpora. Wossidlo also includes 800,000 linguistic slips representing words, phrases, and so on as part of the Low German lexis in alphabetic order. Wossidlo also offers a such called hypergraph search facility. If you type a word into the search field, the first or second row of knots around the search word will be shown. If one gets too much hits, the system offers you to filter out either corpora or types of metadata. Here you see opened or closed eyes. Another search option offers the thesaurus, which still is not finished and must be translated into different languages. Its principal advantage is that the user is guided along trunks to branches, which becomes finer and finer. Our thesaurus work is still continuing. For the special needs of cataloging folk narratives, we created two apps, one for tale type indexes, e.g. the types of international folk tales by Arne Thompson and Ute, but you can also use it for other type indexes, and one for the motive index of Stith Thompson. If you search for a special tale type, e.g. R2555, Fisherman and His Wife, the links are shown which lead you to the sources, here a handwritten letter, and if all data have been recorded into the system, you can see if the source has been published or not. Here it has been published by Siegfried Neumann. And you can also directly go into the library system and find the book. And now I'm just at the end. Concerning usage data, Wossidlo has more than 70,000 visits per annum. In comparison to the Dutch folktale database of the Mertens Institute, this got visited by 1.5 million separate IP addresses. But one must keep in mind that Wossidlo is a regional archive which provides dialectal and handwritten sources. Though much of the users call up Wossidlo from German networks, it is surprisingly called up from over 50 different countries per month. Perhaps the Germans travel so much. I come to the conclusion. The networking modus of structuring collected material has an enormous influence on its publication and will maintain the polyphonic character of an ethnographic knowledge system, whereas in a classical ethnological monograph, the author's perspective and power of interpretation is dominant. The fundamental principle of slip box is a never-ending process of accumulating and linking data, thus causing new associations. According to Niklas Luhmann, his own slip boxes represent a spider-shaped system always ready for docking. The implementation of the hypergraph model in Wossidlo seems to be a very promising new initiative. It depicts the associative logic of an idiosyncratic paper machine expressively. Undoubtedly, the application of algorithmic processes and the network-like representation of folklore corpora by hypergraph will create new questions and perhaps will bring some of the elder questions within our discipline to new light. questions which have been considered obsolete. Collaboration must take place across national borders. Theomeda is never tired of emphasizing the desideratum for an international folktale harvester, and Timothy Tangalini put forward proposal how to manage, for example, automatic classification in the field of belief legends. Our goal is now to develop Wossidlo further by an international cooperation project. Wossidlo should become part of an international harvester. This seems to be the only way for us to deepen Wossidlo's various fields of folktales and their interrelation with other traditional expressive forms, including their dialects, and to present the digital archive multilingually. Above all, the hypergraph model should be used not only to represent ready-made folklore, but folklore in making. For we must finally overcome the epistemological discrepancies or gaps of our conventional archival modes of representation. Thank you for your attention.